So I'll introduce Dr. Schultz. Dr. Schultz practices emergency medicine here at St. Joseph's in Stockton. And he's actually practiced, even though he looks very, very young, he's actually practiced EM for 20 years in various EDs around the country, both in academics, community, locums, and employed medicine. And he's actually soon to be going abroad to be serving as a senior emergency consultant at Launceston?
Launceston, I believe.
Launceston.
I'm not 100% certain how that's pronounced.
Oh, okay. Launceston General Hospital in Tasmania. So that's really cool. So he'll be speaking with us about various practice models in the process of finding a job. And as Dr. Schultz has mentioned, the original lecture was actually done by Dr. Jessica Duke from Yale last year. So he's adopted that lecture. We'll be presenting it to you guys. So over to you, Dr. Schultz.
Okay, here we go. This is attempt to share screen. So this is, by the way, not half an hour, and it shouldn't be. So really, I think that questions will probably bring out stuff that everyone's thinking. So please questions also, that way I don't feel like I'm just talking at a screen. But I know most of you guys, hello. For those who don't know me, hi, I'm Eric. By the way, I'm Eric. I don't think anyone knows that. So I appreciate being called Dr. Schultz, but please, I'm actually trying to get started called by my first name. I have practiced all over the country and all over the world. I trained in Israel, and I have been getting jobs my entire career. I started out in academics and loved it. And then I decided I was going to move to Europe and be like super fancy and write books. And I had a locums job in New York while I was practicing in Europe. Which was fantastic. And those opportunities are not as easy, but they still exist. And then I've since gone to various employment models. I'm like most emergency physicians these days, I have at least 2 jobs almost all the time. And I'm sort of always looking for the next job. So I have a lot of experience in this, and I hope that I can help you with this. And please, again, this is just a broad overview. Please ask questions, because I'm sure if you have that question, someone else also does. There we go. So this is to prepare you for your job hunt, talk about what you should actually be thinking about, and talk about different kinds of work environments and then how to get those jobs. All right. So this is pretty good information. So basically, you have to start thinking now about what you want. And one of the major considerations right now as graduating residents is doing a fellowship versus just getting a job right out of residency. When I graduated, only pure academics did fellowships. It was not something most people did. Now, fellowships are more common. They are probably going to be more important on your resume. And studies have shown actually that people who do fellowships make less money, but are much happier. And I would strongly recommend to take happiness over money every single time. It will serve you better in the long run. So arranging your schedule to consider interviews, pretty straightforward. When I was doing job hunts, jobs were far more plentiful than job seekers. And so it was like, can you work? Can you work yesterday? Can you do 100 shifts? That was the way it was. Now it's a little bit more formal as the job market is a little bit tighter. So you have to consider interviews. I suspect many interviews will be video, but the in-person video interview is good for you as an applicant, probably more so than the job. You want to know if you want that job. And you may not believe it, but you are more valuable than the job. And when you remember that, you remember what kind of job you want, and you'll be happier. And then we'll talk about preparing your CV, personal statement, your letters, blah, blah, blah. So this is some information on fellowships and some dates. Basically, you should be, as seniors, you should have a good idea of what you want to do next year. And if not, you should start to figure it out. There's nothing wrong with just getting a job and trying to get a fellowship later, but that is harder. So I would recommend, if you're thinking at all about a fellowship, that you strongly consider it and at least work on applying for it. And then if you decide later you want to do a clinical job, that's a much easier leap than it is trying to figure out a fellowship later on. So there's some dates out there. So this is huge. Prioritize your goals. Geography is going to be a key factor for most of us. Most of us are in families where we're not the only person who gets to decide. Sorry about that. Geography is not just, it's city versus less urban, it's area of the country. And your geography will oftentimes determine the kind of place you work, but usually in most places you have ability to choose between smaller EDs, larger EDs, that kind of thing. Compensation, I think, is the least important. And I think you should consider it that way. I know loans are a big deal. And you obviously have expenses and whatnot. And compensation is important, but I will put out that it's probably the least important part of your job hunt, because the longer you work and the happier you are, the more money you'll make. That being said, compensation is not nothing, and you should definitely find out before you consider a job what the compensation package is, and that is not always transparent. So you're going to hear a lot of job postings. You're going to make $500,000. What that actually is a total package, which includes the benefits that you would normally expect to be invisible. It sometimes will include your assumed RVUs, and some people, I will talk about what RVU is, but basically it's how much work you do will determine your compensation in most jobs these days. Then there'll be a couple other things. So a total package is sometimes a little bit hard to figure out what it is. Work environment for me is the most important. And I think honestly, that should be always your number one goal. If you are happy at work, you will last longer, you'll do better patient care, your family will love you. The environment is number 1, 2, and 3 for me. Obviously people will have, if you have different priorities, you want to pay off your loans right away, or you want to try different kinds of experiences, but I would strongly recommend you work to being happy first, and everything else will fall into place. Questions so far? Cool. This is all pretty straightforward. Geography, lovely map there. So, kind of where you want to go in the United States practice. There are different advantages and disadvantages of various things. Most of you are going to go where you're from, where your family is, or whatnot. But if you are more flexible on geography, you can be more flexible in the type of work environment you have and your compensation especially. This is compensation in general. The South and the Midwest pays the most in general. It used to be the West paid the least. That's actually, California is getting better on pay. It used to be that when I came out, it was the worst state. And now it's actually pretty good. But we have plenty of other things to make it not so good. But in general, where people want to live, where urbanites want to live, so in general, the East Coast and the West Coast tend to pay less, tend to be more competitive. The farther you get away from a major metro, in general, the jobs will be less competitive and you'll get a better compensation. Also, there's an unfortunate thing called payer mix, which is really horrible, and I hate to mention it, but it's a very important part. The amount of people that pay their ER bills and what kind of insurance they have makes for how much compensation you will eventually get in a large part. So if you're working in a very affluent area, you'll tend to have affluent patients who pay their bills, have good insurance, and you'll tend to make more money. Now, or I should say the group will tend to make more money in the hospital. That doesn't always trickle down, and there's a lot of problems with that. If you work in places with a more underserved population, you will in general make less money because the hospital just has less collections. That's not always the case, but those are the general rules. So in general, affluent areas pay more. And in general, the South and the Midwest pay more. Obviously, those things are completely dependent on the individual group. And a lot of times the group will actually take money you should be having when you're bringing in a lot. And some groups actually are very transparent and give you a lot of money. So it's very individualized. Okay, so work environment. So most of you probably have an idea of what you think you want. And you hopefully will get a chance to experience multiple different kinds of work environments. So you'll learn eventually what you like. I'm an example of somebody who I really thought I wanted to do pure ivory tower academics. I never wanted to touch patients after residency. I was so burned out. Then I went and practiced, and I found out I actually really like taking care of patients, and I really enjoy it. So I did not know what I wanted, but I got a chance to experience it. But eventually you're going to get an idea of what you want, and then you should start narrowing it down. So they're big sort of dividing things: academics versus community. In general, academics tend to be a little bit lower pay. They usually are at higher acuity centers with multiple subspecialties. You usually have lots of backup, and it usually, well, there's a lot of things that it can be. Whereas a community tends to be smaller centers. Obviously, you're not working with residents or medical students. You're doing most of the primary care yourself, which means effectively your nurses are your residents. Tend to be higher pay, tends to be a less backup, which honestly, when you're first graduating, you should have a job where you have no backup. That's my recommendation, at least one job, because that is where you're really going to run really quickly. Obviously, urban versus suburban versus rural. There are major benefits for all of them, and I highly recommend you try those. Especially if you think, I would never want to work rural medicine. I hear this over and over again. I would never want to work in the middle of nowhere. People do it and they love it, like really love it.
Hey, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely, please do.
What is your opinion on new graduates working with residents versus somewhere without residents?
I think that you have to prioritize your postgraduate, your post-residency career. Your first couple of years are just as much of a learning curve as your residency is. So I think that I would strongly recommend that you work at least someplace where you're single coverage or low coverage, someplace where you do not have a lot of subspecialty backup, so that you learn those skills, and you'll learn them very quickly when you have to do them by yourself. If you go to some place like I worked at Stony Brook. Stony Brook is a level 1 trauma center, all the subspecialties, yada yada. If I get into trouble, I have ENT on call. I have all the specialties on call, ready to go, ready to back me up. I have residents who will take a soft admission, as opposed to attendings who say, why are you admitted this? So I strongly recommend you have at least one clinical job that is hard. I think I went straight into residency teaching, and I think my residents appreciated that. I had strengths and I definitely had weaknesses. If I had the perfect job environment, I would work literally 50% academics and 50% BF nowhere, no backup, nothing. I don't think there's any problem with new grads teaching residents. You are far more skilled than you think you are when you get out. And you have a lot to offer. But it's also, if you never leave that protected environment, you will not grow. Is that, and please, more questions, because I really, want to know what you want to know so I can tell you. And please feel free, Tiffany, Dr. Annaberry, there's a bunch of attendings here who have various experiences that I don't have, and I'd love to hear other points of view as well. Okay, so level of trauma care. Here's another myth. Level 1 trauma, you get to do the most. 100% no. The best trauma care is when you have nobody else and you get a gunshot wound and it's just you and your nurses. So if you want to learn how to do trauma, do not work at a trauma center. Because at a trauma center, the gunshot wound comes in, you get the ring down, you've got a million people who show up, and the surgeon will kind of push you out of the way and you'll just do the airway. So there's levels of trauma care, but if you really want a trauma experience, do not work at a trauma center. Work at some place that gets a lot of trauma that doesn't have an on-call surgeon. You will learn really quickly. I did a thoracotomy in the middle of nowhere, and I called my surgeon. He was really nice. He's like, I am in the middle of a gallbladder. It's all you. He was literally like, he had his hands in somebody else's patient. So you had to learn real fast. So that's level of trauma care. Some of you who I practiced in a level 1 trauma center. I was inundated with trauma. When I left residency, I wanted nothing to do with it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That being said, you should work in an environment where you have access to trauma, at least for the first couple of years in your training, or any skills you don't use, you will lose. And last, employment model, which is something that's really important we'll talk about today, because it's hard to know what these things are. And these, by the way, are changing, but I'm going to tell you what my experience has been and what I believe is going on right now. So you've got corporate groups like Team Health that we work for. There are various corporate groups. Some call CMGs, contract medical groups, corporate medical groups. There are democratic groups. Democratic groups, the idea is that it is run purely by physicians, that you vote on everything. Ideally, they would be fully transparent. A lot of times they aren't. We'll talk about that. Hospital employed, you literally just work for the hospital. Locum tenens, I've done a lot of that. I can tell you a lot about that. There's lots of other things you can do, which I like that they've mentioned. Urgent care is certainly an option. International, which I'm about to experience, research, consulting, that kind of thing, probably not right out the gate. So let's talk about these. So corporate groups, regional or national, usually because they are a business, they're good at running a business and they usually pay well. Otherwise, people wouldn't work for them. They talk about the ability to work for multiple EDs, switch jobs within the company is also true. I don't think it's any easier than it is to work for different groups. One thing they do is they do non-compete clauses, which I'm personally hoping that President Biden is going to shoot down. Non-compete basically says when you sign this contract, you cannot work for our competitors. As far as I'm aware, non-competes are actually not legal at all in the state of California. That being said, and this has happened to me, if you're working for an ED and you apply for a job nearby, they'll say, oh, you have a non-compete. We're not even going to look at you. So even if they're not legal, they're definitely binding and they definitely affect you. So again, the primary goal is maximize profit. They're a business. They are not transparent. You are a cog. That is the way it is. I currently work for one. There are advantages and disadvantages. Question about that? Democratic groups. This is supposedly the goal, but there are definitely pluses and minuses to this. I went to school at Temple, and Bob McNamara was the program director and CEO. He's the former president of ABAM, and he's very, very active in trying to make all groups, democratic groups, run by physicians. I think he is right for the most part. Physicians are also terrible business people. There's a reason why a lot of us work for corporate groups. So there's pluses and minuses. Political and financial equity. Yes and no. A lot of democratic groups are run by an inner circle of partners that can take quite a large share of the profit, can make the decisions, and you have to make partner to get a democratic group. Once you make partner, you usually make a lot of money, usually make a percentage of whatever off the top. You have obviously leadership opportunities, voting opportunities. I like what they see. Be aware of nebulous partner expectations. There are definitely groups who will literally hire people, try to burn them out, and then not offer them partnership. And this is not uncommon because if you have 10 partners and you offer add an 11th, you get 10% less of all of these wonderful benefits. So democratic groups are not without their own ills. I do believe, hopefully, they are the wave of the future in emergency medicine. If you can get in a democratic group that is truly democratic, that has a well-established path to partnership that other people have succeeded at. Because a lot of democratic groups say, oh yeah, 2 years you can buy in, and then you find out the last 5 people who tried to make partner quit right before 2 years. That's a signal. But if they are truly democratic, if there truly is an established means to become a partner, which sometimes means a buy-in, which is very reasonable because those people work that hard to get there. If they want you to put money in to be there, is a reasonable request, obviously depending on numbers. Those could be great. And I think they are the best way to provide patient care because physicians should control medicine. The hospital contract may be unstable. That's true for any group. That is not just Democratic groups. Contracts flip. My recent job, they flipped within 3 months. I was working with 3 different groups. It's not a joke. Questions on CMGs, corporate groups versus Democratic groups, anything?
In order to work for these groups, do you have to sign a contract for both, I guess, like the Democratic
Yes.
and
Anybody you work for, you sign a contract. You should sign a contract.
I see. And so even if you're doing like per diem work, you're still.
Well, your contract may simply say that, we offer you shifts and you got to show up. So everyone has a contract. Now you may be contracted to say you must provide 1,750 hours a year. That may be in your contract. Also, no one follows contracts. I'm sorry. If your group is getting hammered and you only have 1,600 hours a year on your contract, they're going to say you need to work 24 shifts this month, and you have to decide how you're going to respond to that. Most of us being workaholics will say yes, and then unfortunately get burned out. So contracts are important and they can protect you legally, but in my experience, no one follows them. And it's really about your ability to stand up for yourself and also to your individual rights, and also sometimes putting your needs behind the group. Sometimes the group needs you to stay late. Sometimes they need extra shifts. So you have to be able to balance that with your group and your director. My experience, the contract, you can quote the contract all you want, no one cares. But the contracts are important to protect you if you truly disagree to the point where you're either going to have legal action or blah, blah, blah. So yes, contracts, everyone has a contract. Contracts have expectations, which are sometimes not met. So just be aware of that. And also you may have things in your contract that are illegal, that are lots of things. And my experience is that they never come up. And the things that come up that are bad are not in your contract. That has been my experience. A lot of people say review your contract with a lawyer. I personally have never done this. It's probably not a bad idea. I just don't know that it's worth it based on my personal experience. If someone doesn't like you, if the group doesn't like you, if the nurses don't like you, if the director doesn't like you, they will find a way to make your life miserable and fire you. If you are liked, you can kill 100 patients and you will stick around. It's unfortunate, but true. I'm kind of ignoring the chat. Let me just see if there's anything in the chat that I need to address. Let's see. Okay, cool. All right, so let's keep going. How do I get rid of that? Sorry. How do I get rid of that chat thing? Sorry, guys. Coming back. Here we go. Hospital employed. So sometimes it's rare these days, but the hospital will directly employ you. So you work for, Dignity Health, whatever. I find it's pretty rare these days. They're all over the world. They tend to be more stable. They tend to pay less. They often will be like a regular job where you're having a W-2. W-2 versus 1099 is a big difference. You need to know that. Long story short, W-2 often has benefits. 1099 in general, you can take more money home especially if you're incorporated with a good accountant. In general, hospital employed tends to be more secure with more benefits, less money, and they will oftentimes kind of expect you to be abused and work those extra hours because you work for the hospital. Second, okay, locum tenens. So locum tenens is a wonderful way to experience lots of different places. Flexibility can be very highly paid. It is, I've done career locum tenens for a lot of my life. You have to be very responsible because you get huge chunks of cash, but you oftentimes are 1099, which means you have to pay estimated tax payments. So if you forget about that, about 25 to 30% of that should be shot at the federal government every 3 months. You have to do your own retirement planning. You should all be maxing out some sort of retirement plan. You have to pay for your own insurance, your own disability, You often should maintain multiple licenses, which can be expensive and require a lot of paperwork. Also, I can talk on a lot, locum tenens. Also, you will usually go through an agent. Those agents are not your friend. They are business people trying to do business. Some of them can be very wonderful and very moral, looking after you, but a lot of them aren't. They will all try to be your friend, and some of them will try to screw you over. So it's very important to, if you're doing locum tenens through an agent, to be very proactive about learning about what's actually happening and what you're getting into. I'm happy to talk about that with anybody. I have a lot of experience with that, but we should probably move on now. Any questions on locum tenens?
Eric, could you talk a little bit about almost kind of like the non-compete within two locums tenant representatives? So the inability, I guess, for one to present you or for you to contact two at the same time, maybe representing one hospital or one ER?
So okay, this is an excellent question. So in general, there's a general morality of locum tenens, whereas you somewhat make contact with an agent. If you're working through an agent, most of us do. You can do locum tenens on your own, but that requires a level of organization and business skills that most of us don't have. You contact through an agent, and then an agent then will introduce you to a hospital. Once you're introduced by an agent to a hospital, you are obligated morally and a lot of times legally to continue to do all business through that agent with that hospital. So say you hate this agent, he's the worst, or she's the worst, you don't like them. I have fired agents before, and I strongly recommend you do if they're not doing their job. You cannot approach that hospital directly. And if so, the agency can ask for money, and very reasonably, because they put out money to try to make those connections. So it's quite reasonable for them to expect to get some repayment if they connect you to a hospital. So once you have been presented by an agent to a hospital, you are, and I believe morally, and also in many cases legally, obligated to continue working with that agent. So it is very important to be careful, because there are unscrupulous agents who will take your CV without telling you, present you to a hospital, and then both the hospital and the agent expect you to do all future business through that agent. That happens all the time. So long story short, agents are trying to do business. They're trying to make money. They're trying to feed their kids. They're not bad people, but you just have to understand where they're coming from. And so a lot of people recommend watermarking their CVs. Like you can literally put a watermark saying only for hospital X. I will write on my CV, may only present it with my prior, written or verbal authorization. I will write that on a CV. I have personally not had a lot of problems with that, but that is important to remember. Once you talk, you're going to talk to an agent, they'll talk to blah, blah, blah. They're very friendly, blah, blah, blah. Let me talk to you. Let me present you this hospital. That is a big stepping stone. If you do that, you are committed to that agent. And then as far as non-competes, that is as far as I'm aware. There are different groups, like for example, Team Health, and many CMGs will say, you are working at XYZ site. You cannot work at non-Team Health sites nearby or anywhere. A lot of the CMGs will go farther and say, if you have presented to a Team Health site within the last 2 years, we will not look at another contract. They want to reduce your mobility within the system. So just beware, if you apply to a job, that may actually prevent you from getting future jobs. This is constantly in flux. So I don't think there's any established guidelines, but just know every time you apply for a job, it means something. Also, credentialing is an utter bear. It's a lot of paperwork, which is unpaid for. And also, once you credential at a facility, every future facility you credential at will want to know about that facility and will oftentimes request paperwork from that facility. So if you go out working for 10 places right away, which I did, you will find later it becomes much more cumbersome to get future jobs. So just take look carefully when assessing a new job. You can't know everything when you get in. You're not going to know. And in general, locums tenens jobs are because they cannot fill the site with hospital employees or full-time employees. They tend to be less desirable. Location, environment, there's usually something about the job that most people don't like. So just be aware of that. That being said, I have found places that the people don't like that I loved. So it's that part's individual. So that was a long explanation. Did that explain what you were trying to get across?
Wonderful explanation. Thanks, Dr. Schultz.
Thank you. Moving on. Other factors. Okay, so this is, jobs, what they're expecting. Schedule, usually most jobs that are employed or full-time, they expect a certain number of hours per year. They will change that if they need, and that's appropriate, but you have to learn how to set boundaries. Because most groups, if they need help, will ask you to work more than you're willing to, and it's always a constant sort of negotiation. RVUs, resource value units. What is the actual?
Relative value units.
Relative value units basically means that it kind of tries to assess how much work you do per patient, and that can be turned into a compensation model. So if you've got one doc who's seeing 10 patients, they're all toothaches. Those are very low RVUs, but multiple patients. So they'll make, 10 times RVU X. You're seeing one doc that sees 10 ICU patients with critical care and multiple studies, they'll hopefully make more money, as opposed to the other docs who sees 20 of the toothaches. So it's basically a conglomerate of number of patients plus acuity, severity, complexity of patients to try to put that together to see how hard you worked, and this is how much money you should make. This is what we use at Stockton. This is what a lot of sites use. You should get used to it. I personally don't like it. I'm actually quite good at it. I work hard and I document well, but I don't like the way that it designs medicine, but it is there. Get used to it, get used to documenting well so you make lots of RVUs. Backup is another thing. Some places expect you to be on call in case a physician calls out. I find that to be pretty rare, and they're usually pretty straightforward about that. Like docs just don't call out. It just doesn't happen. Administrative support, huge. Do you have a secretary at the ED? That is enormous. I personally would not want to ever work in the ED without a secretary. That to me is more important than a lot of factors because, someone doing your calls for you is huge. But also, especially if you're in a research center, having a research assistant, having somebody to help you through various things is huge. Stony Brook was fantastic. They basically just put me from person to person. Here's your statistician. Here's your person that's going to help you through the research part. They were fantastic. Other places are like, have some fun. Nursing is huge. Absolutely. Not only your nursing coverage, but your the disposition of the nurses, how well you get along with them. Ancillary staff, obviously, this is all huge. This is a huge part of your ability to take care of patients and enjoy yourself. Contracts, we talked a little bit about. Everyone that has a contract, you may or may not be asked to do a certain number of hours in your contract. You may be asked you may have a non-compete, You may want to consider you should look at your first contract very closely and see a bunch of stuff you'll never see again. There's absolutely nothing wrong with looking through a contract, literally just crossing off stuff you don't like and sending it back. That may cost you your job, but usually it doesn't. It's very important to be aware of what's in the contract, but also be aware that the contracts are rarely actually followed through in clinical practice. Intangibles, obviously, whatever. I love having a physician call room that you can go to escape. I like having a doc box that's isolated from patients, and I did quit jobs because they didn't have enough place for me to escape. The physical layout's huge. Lots of things. So we just went over a bunch of stuff. Any questions or comments on that?
Looks like we're about 8 minutes over.
Okay.
Yeah. Did anyone have any additional questions for Dr. Schultz?
So one last thing, your best, absolute best resource is word of mouth. You will get calls by recruiters. You'll get this, you'll get a bunch of people telling you that. Your best bet is to reach out to your friends that work at a place and find out what's going on. Develop those word of mouth things. I think I maybe have gotten one job in my entire career that wasn't word of mouth, and I've had so many jobs. But yeah, that's it. Good luck. You feel free to reach out to me. I don't know if you guys have my email. My email address is erscutmonkey. That is erscutmonkey@gmail. Or, reach me at Stockton or whatever. I'm happy to talk with you about that kind of stuff.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schultz. And check in the chat if I documented it correctly so that people could copy it and email you as needed. Thank you again, Dr. Schultz. Your vast experience will definitely be used by this group of residents.